Ever since our astronauts first walked on the moon, the question of the big silence has become more and more profound. The big silence is the reference to the fact that although after a very short technical history we have begun space travel, no extraterrestrial has contacted us. It has become somewhat scientifically unfashionable to assume that we are the only life in the universe, or if there are other civilizations, that we are the most advanced. Those who still stuck to this archaic theory use the big silence as evidence that we must be the only intelligent life in the universe, since, statistically, if there were any intelligent life in the universe, if there were any others, there should be lots of them. If there were any others, there should be lots of others. If there are lots of others, then, statistically speaking, we should have been contacted long ago. So we build giant telescopes, both optical and radio, but still we fail to get the faintest whisper necessary to break the big silence. When I was first introduced to the study of history, I asked, why study the past? The answer was, so as to not make the same mistakes in the future. If we look at the history of scientific thought, we will find an extreme resistance to change that seems to be the rule. The exception, quite often, is the radical thinker who later becomes an historical figure himself due to his refusal to accept approved theory. There have been, of course, many radical thinkers who were wrong. The test of the new theory is the important phase of scientific advance. The big problem has always been to get the scientific community to look seriously at any theory that is not very closely associated with current scientific thought. If one of our radio telescopes suddenly started picking up signals from space, and the decoding of these resulted in information telling us just what we expected, I believe this would be more suspicious than the big silence itself. The one thing that should be most expected of extraterrestrial contact is the unexpected. The reason that we're having these talks is to report what is quite possibly the solution to the big silence. If, in the 18th century, you had asked a scientist to describe the best form of long-distance communication, he would have described some type of visual signaling. Now we recognize the radio signal as most efficient and tend to assume that this would be the means of long-distance communication used by an advanced extraterrestrial signaler. The SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the SETI project is an obvious example of this type of thinking. If a SETI project had been developed 200 years ago, they would have probably monitored the moon with a telescope hoping to see smoke signals. It is difficult to see ourselves in the role of the 18th century scientist making an obvious mistake in judgment due to lack of knowledge of the normal form of communication to be used a scant 200 years later in history. As if I recorded in this dialogue the numerous similar mistakes my research group and I made in getting to our present method of communication techniques, you would have a very thick volume through which to watch. My intention, therefore, will be to cover the results of some 20 years of experimental work rather than to try to describe our methods. Please keep in mind that we didn't pull these techniques out of a hat and achieve instant success, but through years of research and the process of trial and error, achieved the quality that helped in producing our current level of communication. 20th century scientists employs the concept of electromagnetic resonance in most of its communication devices. A mechanical analogy of electromagnetic resonance would be the breaking of a crystal goblet by the precise resonant sound generated by an opera singer. Electromagnetic resistance is achieved by an exact balance of induction and capacitance in a circuit. A simple radio receiver relies on a variable capacitor in parallel with a suitable coil of wire inductively linked to an antenna. The size of the plate of the capacitor, the number of turns of wire in the coil, and the length of the antenna are all related to the nature of the electromagnetic wave to be received. In order to receive a signal, the value of capacitance is varied by tuning until resonance with the signal is achieved. This is the key to radio reception. We can assume that radio communication is a primitive form of communication simply because we have developed it. This, of course, follows from the assumption that we are a primitive race. That, to me, seems quite reasonable. A long study of telepathy convinced me that the mind could be used much more effectively as a communication device than the crude electrical circuitry of radio. Electromagnetic theory did, however, provide some clues and fundamental concepts for experimental work with telepathy. At this point, I do not intend to try to explain these concepts. This will be much easier after you are acquainted with the nature of the universe as described here now shortly. For the time being, it will be sufficient to say that I use a carefully tuned human brain in place of a electric circuitry of a radio transceiver. The ears replace a microphone, and the vocal mechanism replaces the speaker. The inhabiting mind is temporarily removed by a precise method, and communication with a resonant external system is possible. The tuning process is quite complex and took about 12 years to perfect. Since January 15th, 1981, our research group has been using this form of communication to question a sixth density social memory complex. Exactly what a sixth density social memory complex is will be explained later. But for now, consider it to be an extraterrestrial race. The results of this contact are contained throughout these videos. Please remember to refrain from jumping to conclusions based on previous ideas of the nature of the universe and yourself. Make your judgment after finishing and contemplating on this material. It was an important and is an important part of the contact that the format is exclusively question and answer. Roz answers to my questions. These ensures minimal confusion on my part, and I try to that we comprehend their concepts. In session 2, dated January 20th, 1981, Ross said, queries are in order in your projections of mind distortion at this time space. Thusly, would I assure this group that my own social memory complex has one particular method of communication with those few who may be able to harmonize their distortions with ours, and that is to respond to queries for information. We are comfortable with this format. Now understand, 11,000 years ago, emissaries of the social memory complex known as Ra landed on Earth in order to give important information to Earth's inhabitants. Unfortunately, the people of that era were not able to comprehend the teachings of Ra civilization and tended to worship them as gods. For this reason, we find the sun god Ra prominent in Egyptian history. Ra has complete use of several languages due to close monitoring of Earthman's activities for the last 11,000 years. Sometimes the sentence structure is a little cumbersome, but the use of words is always precise. After leaving Earth, they continued to closely monitor Earthman's activities up to our present day. They felt an obligation to someday unsnarl the myths and misconceptions that their visit had caused. They originally came to Earth to attempt to teach their understanding of a universal law that they call the Law of One. In Session 1, dated January 15, 1981, Ra said, "The identity of the vibration Ra is our identity. We, as a group, or what you would call a social memory complex, made contact with a race of your planetary kind, which you call Egyptians. Others from our density made contact at the same time in South America, and the so-called lost cities were their attempts to contribute to the Law of One. We spoke to one who heard and understood and was in a position to decree the Law of One. However, the priests and peoples of that era quickly distorted our message, robbing it of the, shall we say, compassion with which unity is informed by its very nature. Since it contains all, it cannot abhor any. When we were no longer able to have appropriate channels through which to enunciate the Law of One, we removed ourselves from the now hypocritical position which we had allowed ourselves to be placed in. Other myths, shall we say, having more to do with polarity and the things of your vibration that are complex, again took over in that particular society complex. Some of the terms used by Ra will be confusing until later comprehension is made. They speak in the preceding paragraph of vibration, which is a term for their understanding of the nature of what we call the atomic structure of our reality. Ra has a single philosophical system that embraces the entirety of their knowledge as a single unit. They find our language inadequate for the conveyance of much of their knowledge, but always seem to pick the best words we have available for their descriptions. Since what we call the separate philosophies of science and religion are merged in their understanding, we find that we use terms scientific and religious concepts intermingling in their communications. Raw science begins with the creation of the universe and includes mind and spirit as an integral part of the study of the material universe. Their technology is not only far in advance of ours, but it is based on totally different principles. These principles are a product of a much deeper understanding of the structure of the universe. They refer to people as mind, body, spirit complexes, thusly indicating that all of us are composed of three basic parts. Much of their technology would appear less than complex to us since it is based on geometrical ratios such as the Great Pyramid at Giza. And my brothers and sisters, as to not make this session too long, we will continue in another video. In the love and in the light, this is Robert. Be in peace, my sisters and brothers.